we're going to cover the peripheral nervous system. So if we're looking at a simple spinal reflex, and we've looked at this in a previous session, we have automatics. If we're thinking about what a spinal reflex is, it's an automatic rotor response coordinated entirely within the spinal cord. So there's no conscious awareness of this reflex going on, or no inhibition of it, so to speak. And the wiring of a single reflex is called a reflex arc. But as we'll talk about, some reflexes you can actually attempt to inhibit, because a lot of reflex arcs, not all, but a lot of reflex arcs are involving skeletal muscle, and we can theoretically help to control skeletal muscle contractions by conscious inhibition. And there are 5 basic components of all reflex arcs. And these are the steps that are shown in this diagram. So the stimulus, a nice easy stimulus for us to think about. You put your hand on a pinprick, on a pin, for example. So that's arrival of the stimulus. It's you stimulate so the stimulus activates a sensory neuron, and these stretched dendrites lead to a graded potential, and presuming this stimulus is strong enough, which I'm presuming it is, you put your hand onto a sharp object, the graded potential is strong enough to generate an action potential. And that action potential obviously then passes, you get activation of the sensory neuron, comes in through the dorsal root, and there's our dorsal root ganglion where all the cell bodies are accumulating, comes in through our dorsal root and synapses in the grey matter, and so within our spinal cord. And our excitatory neurotransmitter is released, producing an EPSP, which is an excitatory postsynaptic potential, which is integrated with other signals that are arriving. So you might be getting inhibitory synapses and stimulatory ones at the same time. And so in this diagram, you can see an interneuron, which it's communicating with, and then that crosses the spinal cord and will move up to the brain via a variety of collaterals. But you can see the ventral root you have in our reflex, you have information processing within the central nervous system, activation of the motor neuron, which passes out through our ventral root, and then response by the effector, by in this case stimulating skeletal muscle movement, and we move away. So that's your response. Now the simple reflex, this is the simple reflex arc that I'm showing. So you can see that's why it's called an arc, without the conscious awareness. Because theoretically you could put your hand on something sharp, and you could, or something really painful, and you could theoretically try and hold your hand on it the whole time. And that's you consciously trying to prevent basically a reflex arc from occurring. So if it's a very strong stimuli, so if it's just a weak stimuli and you just put your hand onto something sharp, you may just move the arm away. So you might contract the biceps primarily and relax the triceps, obviously. But if it's a strong stimuli, this information, interneurons will carry the signals up and down the spinal cord, and then motor neurons will come out at different levels of the spinal cord, potentially affecting motor neurons in many segments. And depending on the stimulus size, you may get contraction may occur in the hand, the wrist, the arm, the shoulders, for example. So a mild discomfort may only provoke a brief contraction of muscles in the hand and wrist. A more powerful stimulus may affect the hand, wrist, forearm, and arm, and severe pain may also stimulate contractions of the shoulder, trunk, and even potentially the legs, forcing you to jump away from that stimulus. So it depends on the intensity of that stimulus, but also how much information is being passed up and down the spinal cord and coming out of the ventral root at other levels of the spinal cord to stimulate skeletal muscle within the trunk, within the upper arm, within the legs, for example. We also need to classify the different reflexes. That was a nice simple reflex. Okay? We can classify them in different ways. We can classify them as innate reflexes, so genetically determined. For example, the suckling reflex. They can be acquired, which are learned, for example, the emergency brake in a car. So if you're an inexperienced car driver, you've only just passed, you might be a lot slower to press the brake in an emergency situation than someone who's more experienced, because it's a learned reflex. They can be classified by motor response. So is it somatic, so skeletal muscle? Is it visceral, which is part of your autonomic nervous system? So an autonomic reflex of the smooth cardiac muscles and glands, for example. Is it complex? How complex is it? Is it monosynaptic? Is it just a single synapse? Is it polysynaptic with multiple synapses from 2 to several hundred, so therefore very complex? Or by its processing site? Is it within the spinal cord, or is it within the cranium, so within the brain? So if we're thinking about developmental reflexes, there are some innate reflexes, and these are the result of connections that form between neurons during development. And they're generally predictable. So for example, withdrawal from pain, chewing or suckling reflex, tracking objects with the eyes. Think about it when there's a newborn, the midwife might be trying to get them to follow the eyes. Are the eye movements looking normal? Blinking when eyelashes are touched. There are all these very predictable innate reflexes. You've got the acquired reflexes. So these are more complex learned motor patterns, and they're enhanced by repetition. And the example I gave you a few minutes ago was that emergency stop whilst braking. So an experienced driver tends to be better because they have practiced more. It's an acquired reflex. But of course, many reflexes can be modified over time or suppressed through conscious effort if you have to. So an example of a modified reflex or a suppressed one, not that I would do it, but you might be walking on a tightrope over a canyon. Not something I would particularly do. A bit dangerous in my books, especially with the balance that I would have on a rope. But you'd ignore a bee sting in this situation that you wouldn't normally ignore, for example. Weird example, but one that came into my head. So now we'll go on to monosynaptic reflexes. So these are sensory neurons. This is where sensory neurons synapse directly onto a motor neuron. So in other words, there's no interneuron in between. The transmission always involves a time delay. So any synaptic transmission involves a time delay. So the fact that there's only a single synapse means that we're minimizing that delay before the response takes place. But most reflexes have at least one interneuron in place. So monosynaptic reflexes are quite rare. Most are polysynaptic reflexes, and there's a longer delay in this case between the stimulus and the response. And that's because you've got more synapses to cross. So the length of delay is proportional to the number of synapses involved. And this includes the more complicated responses because interneurons can control motor neurons that activate several muscle groups simultaneously. So if we're looking at some of the simple monosynaptic reflexes, these control the most rapid motor responses. A great example is your stretch reflex, your patellar knee reflex. So when you tap on the patellar tendon, this induces stretch of quadricep muscles. So when the patellar tendon, when the tap on the patellar tendon induces stretch of the quadricep muscle. So here you can see the quadricep muscle, here you can see the stretch receptor. So when you tap it, you stretch that quadricep muscle. That obviously then activates a sensory neuron, which triggers reflex contraction of the stretch muscle. This is your knee kick. So if we're following the pattern, here is our excitatory or sensory neuron coming in. You can see its synapses within the grey matter immediately on to the motor neuron to the extensor muscles. So what then happens is you get an excitatory synapse, you get stimulation of the extensor muscle, and the motor neuron comes all the way to the extensor muscle that was originally stretched, as well as to other extensor muscles. And this stimulation of those extensor muscles, of course, causes contraction of their stretched muscle, which is counteracting the stimulus. You can also see at the same time there's an interneuron up in the top here. This is labeled B, and you can see that this interneuron is then an inhibitory synapse going on. This is the motor neuron to the flexor muscle, which is then obviously going to relax. So we get contraction of the extensor, relaxation of the flexor. So this is a monosynaptic synapse, okay, this first one going to A and C, whereas this is polysynaptic because there's 2 synapses going to the inhibitory, going to the flexor muscle, which is going to relax. The receptors in these stretch reflexes, so present there, are called muscle spindles, just so you know what the name is. So this is called monosynaptic as the counteracting response only requires contraction of the quads, the extensor muscle. However, remember, looking at the diagram and how I've explained it, there are interneurons which are providing relaxation of the opposing muscle, your flexor muscle, your hamstrings. Therefore, technically that part is polysynaptic, but one part is monosynaptic, as I mentioned earlier. So that's your simple monosynaptic reflex. Polysynaptic reflexes are much, much more complex, and there are many, many examples that you could potentially think about. And they're due to the presence of interneurons that can control several muscle groups. And they can produce either your EPSPs or your IPSPs, your excitatory or your inhibitory postsynaptic potentials. And you're getting stimulation of some muscles and inhibition of others. And a great example is the flexor, the withdrawal reflex. And again, this is something that we've already talked about. And in this example, you'll get sensory neurons activate many, many pools of interneurons. So your stimulus here in this case is your sensory receptor in the skin. You touch something very, very hard. Passes through the afferent pathway, through the dorsal root ganglia. So there's your ganglia with a group of cell bodies, in through your dorsal root, and where it synapses. And you can see with 1, 2, 3, they've labeled them nicely for us at that point. So you can see this sensory neuron can activate pools of interneurons. A strong, and so some of these, if we're watching, number 1 will be stimulatory, and you can see it's moving to the biceps to help you move away, so it's stimulating contraction of the biceps. You can say an inhibitory signal is being passed again through the ventral root to the triceps, to your extensor, which relaxes. But also you can see how it crosses over, how it synapses and passes the information up to the brain. So we're getting that information, that processing power. We're getting conscious awareness of it. So we're getting the reflex, which is much quicker than it actually getting to our brain in conscious awareness. So in other words, you've moved away from the pain before you've even had conscious awareness of it, just because of the speed of the reflex. So like I said, the sensory neurons are activating many pools of interneurons. And a strong stimuli, interneurons, will carry these signals up and down the spinal cord, affecting motor neurons in many segments. And so depending on the stimulus size, like I've said before, contraction may occur in the hand, wrist, arms, shoulders, legs, whatever it might be. So now we're going to think about the effect of the brain on spinal reflexes. So our higher centers can affect reflex responses. So we have descending tracts in the brain. They can synapse on interneurons and motor neurons in the spinal cord. And they're continuously producing EPSPs and IPSPs. So obviously the EPSPs make the neurons more sensitive to other stimuli. So therefore it's about facilitation and reinforcement. So trying to stimulate an action potential. And IPSPs make neurons less sensitive to other stimuli. So they're involved with inhibition. And by stimulating excitatory or inhibitory interneurons, higher centers can adjust the sensitivity of reflexes. So a common test that is done clinically is stroking the sole of the foot. Now, a normal response in adults, a normal plantar response would be toe curling. So toes flexion downwards. And in infants, what you would see is fanning of the toes. And the toes basically go upwards. And this is called the Babinski sign. And the Babinski sign disappears as our descending motor pathways develop. So in other words, infants are born with fanning of the toes, but as the Babinski sign disappears and the descending motor pathways develop, it'll start to disappear. But if either the higher centers or the descending tracts are damaged, then the Babinski sign can reappear in an adult. So therefore, as a result, this reflex is often tested if CNS injury is suspected. So you would expect to see a normal plantar response, so the toes would go down. You might suspect injury if you're getting fanning of the toes. Okay, a review question for you. So press pause, have a little look, and tell me what the answer is. Is it A, B, C, D, or E? Press pause. Okay, so hopefully the answer is B. So the first thing is arrival of a stimulus and activation of a receptor, followed by activation of a sensory neuron, followed by processing within the CNS. Then you've got activation of your motor neuron, and finally response by an effector, whatever that effector happens to be.